There's no worse place for a trucker than Highway 666, and no worse time to be there than after dark. I used to think that was just a ghost story, something truckers swapped over greasy diner counters to make long hauls less boring. I'd heard it all: the hitchhiker who vanishes into thin air, phantom rigs with no drivers, and even tales of shadows chasing trucks into the night. But none of those stories ever felt real to me. They were just entertainment, something to laugh about when you were 2 cups of bad coffee deep and half delirious from lack of sleep. Then, I drove Highway 666 for the first time. I pulled Black Betty, my old 1987 Peterbilt 359, into a dusty gas station on the outskirts of Gallup, New Mexico, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Betty was a beast of a truck, all muscle and attitude, but she had her quirks. Her engine liked to sputter when the weather got cold, and the radio only worked when it felt like it. The gas station was the kind of place you wouldn't look twice at: cracked pavement, flickering fluorescent lights, and a bored attendant leaning on the counter inside. The neon, "Open 24 hours" sign buzzed faintly, half of the letters burned out. I climbed out of the cab, groaning as my knees protested the movement. 60 years old and still driving long hauls, I should have retired years ago, but the road was all I had left. As I was topping off Betty's tank, I noticed an old-timer sitting on a bench near the station's entrance. He was hunched over, nursing a thermos of what I assumed was coffee. His face was weathered, the kind of face that had seen too much and said too little. "You headed west?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. I nodded. "Yeah, aiming to make Flagstaff by morning." The man squinted at me, his eyes sharp despite the tired lines around them. "Taking 491, huh?" "Yeah," I said, shrugging. "It's the fastest route." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Fastest way to trouble, more like. You know what they call that stretch, don't ya?" I knew where this was going. "Let me guess. Highway 666. He nodded, his expression serious. "The Devil's Highway." I laughed it off. "Come on, you don't really believe all that ghost story crap, do you?" The man's face didn't change. He set his thermos down and reached into the pocket of his worn denim jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "You're gonna need this," he said, handing it to me. I unfolded it, frowning at the handwritten list of rules. Rule number 1: if you see a red car behind you with no driver, turn off your lights and keep driving until it's gone. Rule number 2: don't leave your truck at 12:12 a.m. Rule number 3: never pick up a hitchhiker, no matter what they look like. Rule number 4: if your radio starts playing static, don't touch it. Turn off the engine and wait. Rule number 5: if you see a deer standing in the middle of the road, don't stop. Drive through it. Rule number 6: if you hear knocking on the passenger side door, don't look or respond. Just keep driving. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a final warning: break these rules, and you'll find out why they call it the Devil's Highway. I rolled my eyes and handed the paper back. "Thanks, but I think I'll take my chances." The old man didn't move to take it. "Keep it," he said. "You'll thank me later." His tone sent a small shiver down my spine, but I shoved the paper into my jacket pocket anyway. "Appreciate the warning, but I've been driving trucks for 30 years. Pretty sure I can handle one highway." The man shook his head, his gaze fixed on me. "It ain't about how good you are. It's about what's out there." I didn't have time for his cryptic nonsense. I climbed back into Betty, fired up the engine, and rolled out of the gas station. The first stretch of Highway 666 was uneventful, just miles of cracked asphalt cutting through the desert. The sun had set completely by the time I hit the main stretch, leaving the road bathed in darkness. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating the empty highway ahead. I turned on the radio, hoping for some static-filled classic rock to keep me company, but all I got was silence. Figures. Betty's radio had been acting up for months. I settled in for the long haul, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of tires on pavement the only sounds. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, a vast expanse of nothingness broken only by the occasional cactus or crumbling building. As I drove, my thoughts drifted to my wife, Karen. She'd been gone for over a decade now, but the guilt still weighed on me. I'd been on the road the night she'd had the accident. She'd called, asking me to come home early, but I'd brushed her off, too focused on making my delivery deadline. She'd died alone, and I'd been hundreds of miles away. I shook the thought away, gripping the wheel tighter. The road was no place for memories like that. The first sign that something was wrong came about an hour into the drive. The air inside the cab grew colder, enough to make me reach for the heater controls. I glanced at the temperature gauge, but it read normal. Outside, the desert was still, the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the landscape. Then I saw it, a red car in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cars came and went on highways all the time, though I hadn't seen another vehicle in over 30 miles. But something about this car felt off. It kept a steady distance behind me, its headlights bright and unblinking. And then I noticed the driver's seat was empty. A chill ran down my spine as the old man's words echoed in my mind. If you see a red car behind you with no driver, turn off your lights and keep driving until it's gone. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. There was no one in that car. I reached for the paper in my jacket pocket, my hands shaking slightly as I unfolded it. Rule 1 stared back at me. If you see a red car behind you with no driver, turn off your lights and keep driving until it's gone. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the wheel. Turning off my lights in the middle of a dark highway felt like asking for trouble. But as the car crept closer, its headlights impossibly bright, I realized I didn't have much of a choice. I reached for the light switch and flicked it off. The cab plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the dashboard. My heart pounded as I stared straight ahead, refusing to look in the mirrors. For what felt like an eternity, I drove blind, the hum of the engine the only sound. My hands were slick with sweat, my breath coming in short gasps. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the red car was gone. I turned the lights back on, my hands trembling. The highway was empty, the desert stretching out in all directions. But the sense of unease lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. When I turned my headlights back on, I half expected the red car to still be there, its driverless form hovering just beyond the glow of my beams. But the highway ahead was empty, nothing but asphalt stretching endlessly into the dark desert. I gripped the wheel tightly, trying to steady my breathing. Just a trick of the light, I muttered to myself, though the words sounded hollow. Black Betty hummed beneath me, her engine a steady reassurance against the unease creeping up my spine. But even as I drove on, my eyes kept flicking to the mirrors, half expecting to see those bright headlights reappear. About 30 miles down the road, I spotted a rest area sign. Normally, I'd just push through, but my nerves were frayed, and the caffeine I'd chugged back at the gas station wasn't doing the trick. I pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch of tires on loose stone loud in the stillness. The rest stop was little more than a weathered picnic table and a crumbling restroom, the kind of place you'd only stop at if you were desperate. The night air was cold, biting against my skin as I stepped out of the cab. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the truck's engine. I stretched my legs, pacing a little to shake off the tension. The desert seemed endless under the pale light of the moon, the shadows of distant cacti stretching like claws across the ground. As I lit a cigarette, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the distance. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but then it came again, a shadow darting between the skeletal remains of the picnic table and the restroom. I froze, the cigarette dangling from my lips. The figure was humanoid but wrong, its movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet with tangled strings. I took a step back toward the truck, my heart pounding. Climbing back into the cab, I locked the doors behind me and pulled the crumpled piece of paper from my jacket pocket. The old man's rules stared back at me, each one more absurd than the last. If you see a red car behind you with no driver, turn off your lights and keep driving until it's gone. Don't leave your truck at 12:12 a.m. Never pick up a hitchhiker, no matter what they look like. If your radio starts playing static, don't touch it. Turn off the engine and wait. If you see a deer standing in the middle of the road, don't stop. Drive through it. If you hear knocking on the passenger side door, don't look or respond. Just keep driving. My eyes lingered on Rule 2. I checked the clock on the dashboard. 11:47 p.m. I wasn't planning on sticking around long enough to test that one. I took another drag of my cigarette and threw it out the window before putting Betty back into gear. The tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled out of the rest area and back onto the highway, the familiar hum of the engine soothing my nerves. But the relief was short-lived. A glance in the rearview mirror made my stomach drop. A faint shadow moved across the road behind me, darting in and out of the darkness like it was chasing the truck. I clenched the wheel tighter, my foot pressing harder on the gas. The shadow kept pace, its form indistinct but wrong. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. I hadn't even fully processed the shadow when the red car appeared again. Its headlights flared to life in the rearview mirror, impossibly bright against the black night. My pulse spiked as I realized it was closer this time, its driver's seat just as empty as before. My hands shook as I reached for the light switch, flicking it off without hesitation. Darkness swallowed the cab, and I held my breath, relying on the faint glow of the dashboard to keep me on the road. For several agonizing seconds, the hum of the engine and the thrum of the tires were my only companions. And then I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft scraping sound, like metal dragging against asphalt. It grew louder, sharper, until it felt like the red car was right behind me, clawing at the back of the truck with invisible hands. I gritted my teeth, refusing to look in the mirrors. The old man's voice echoed in my head, "Keep driving until it's gone." I pushed the gas pedal harder, Black Betty roaring in response. The scraping sound turned into a screech, nails on a chalkboard that made my teeth ache. And then, just like that, it was gone. The sound stopped. The air in the cab grew warmer. I turned my lights back on, the highway ahead empty and quiet once more. My breath came in short gasps, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I glanced at the mirrors, half expecting the red car to reappear, but there was nothing. "Damn it," I muttered, wiping the sweat from my brow. I pulled over a few miles later, my hands shaking too much to keep driving. I parked on the shoulder, leaving the engine running as I leaned back in the seat, my eyes fixed on the horizon. The desert stretched out endlessly before me, but it felt smaller somehow, like the shadows were closing in. I thought about the old man at the gas station, about the rules he'd handed me. What the hell had I gotten myself into? After a few minutes, I forced myself to keep driving. Sitting still felt like a mistake, like I was inviting whatever was out there to come closer. The rules were ridiculous, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen, and what I'd barely escaped. If I wanted to make it to Flagstaff in one piece, I'd have to follow them. All of them. Even if I didn't understand why. The steady hum of Black Betty's engine was the only sound keeping me grounded as I pushed deeper into Highway 666. I tried to convince myself that the rules were nothing more than superstitious nonsense, but the memory of the red car, and that thing chasing me, was burned into my mind. The highway stretched on endlessly, the landscape around me blending into a monotonous haze of dark desert and pale moonlight. The stars above seemed unnaturally bright, their cold glow casting jagged shadows across the barren terrain. I reached for the thermos of coffee I'd brought along, but my hands trembled as I unscrewed the cap. It wasn't the caffeine I needed. It was a distraction, anything to keep me from looking too hard at the empty road behind me. The first sign of trouble came with a cough. Black Betty's engine sputtered, the low rumble breaking into an uneven stutter that made my heart skip a beat. I adjusted my grip on the wheel, muttering under my breath. "Not now, girl. Don't do this to me now." The dashboard lights flickered, and for a moment, the cab was plunged into near darkness. The truck bucked like a wild horse, the engine choking on its own breath. Then, with a final sputter, Betty went silent. The truck coasted to a stop, the heavy silence pressing down on me like a weight. I stared at the dashboard, the needles on the gauges dropping to zero. Outside, the desert was still, the faint rustle of the wind the only sound. I cursed under my breath and reached for my flashlight. I'd been driving trucks long enough to know that breakdowns were part of the job, but out here, in the middle of nowhere, it felt different. I glanced at the dashboard clock. 12:05 a.m. Rule 2 popped into my mind like an unwelcome guest. Don't leave your truck at 12:12 a.m. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. 7 minutes. That's all I had to figure out what was wrong and get back inside. Climbing out of the cab, I grabbed the flashlight from its clip and popped the hood. The cold desert air bit at my skin, but it wasn't just the temperature that made me shiver. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I leaned over the engine, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. A quick glance told me it wasn't anything obvious. No loose belts, no visible leaks. "Come on, Betty," I muttered, tapping the side of the engine block. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that made my blood run cold. Whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as the seconds passed, the voices became clearer, more distinct. They weren't coming from the desert, they were coming from the darkness just beyond the truck's headlights. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing in an otherworldly cadence. I turned, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the desert. At first, I saw nothing, just the endless stretch of sand and rock. But then the shadows began to move. They slithered across the ground, pooling together like ink spilled on paper. As I watched, the darkness coalesced into a shape, a figure tall and angular, its limbs too long and its movements too fluid. It stood at the edge of the light, its featureless face tilted as if it were watching me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The clock on the dashboard read 12:10 a.m. 2 minutes, I whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The whispers seemed to come from it now, the words unintelligible but heavy with malice. I scrambled back into the cab, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. The figure stopped just outside the passenger side window, its face inches from the glass. I couldn't see its features, just the faint outline of its head against the darkness. The whispers filled the cab, wrapping around me like cold fingers. I pressed my back against the driver's seat, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The clock ticked over to 12:12 a.m. The figure moved. The cab shuddered as the figure pressed against the door, the metal groaning under its weight. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare move. The clock ticked to 12:13 a.m., and the figure vanished. The cab was silent again, the air inside still and heavy. My hands trembled as I reached for the ignition, turning the key with desperate hope. Black Betty roared to life, her engine rumbling like a thunderstorm. "Good girl," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't waste any time. Shifting into gear, I pressed the accelerator and put as much distance as I could between myself and that stretch of highway. As I drove, I couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure. Its presence lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to breaking Rule 2. The rules weren't just superstition. They were survival. I glanced at the crumpled piece of paper on the dashboard, my pulse quickening as I reread the list. This wasn't just a highway, it was a gauntlet. And I wasn't sure I'd make it out alive. I had barely recovered from my run-in with the shadow figure when I spotted her. She was standing on the shoulder of the highway, her silhouette illuminated by the glow of Black Betty's headlights. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was just a cactus or a cluster of rocks. But as I got closer, I saw the shape resolve into something unmistakably human, a woman in a white dress, her arm outstretched in a desperate plea for help. I felt my stomach twist. Rule 3, never pick up a hitchhiker, no matter what they look like. I eased off the accelerator, my hands tightening on the wheel. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, her long dark hair blowing in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with what I could only describe as fear. She stepped closer to the road as I approached, waving her arm frantically. Every instinct screamed at me to stop. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, my heart pounding. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, You break the rules, and you'll find out why they call it the Devil's Highway. But what if she was real? What if she was just some poor girl stranded out here, alone in the dark? I could practically hear Karen's voice in my head. You can't just leave her there, Jack. I tightened my grip on the wheel and pressed the gas. Black Betty rumbled past the woman, her figure vanishing in the glow of the headlights. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look in the mirrors. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But as the truck powered forward, the air inside the cab grew colder, and a soft knock sounded on the passenger side window. My breath caught in my throat. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, a woman's voice, faint but insistent. Please, please help me. I didn't look. I couldn't. The knocking turned into pounding, the sound reverberating through the cab. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, my heart thundering in my chest. The voice grew louder, more frantic. You promised. You promised to help me. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, Betty roaring in response. The pounding stopped, but when I glanced in the side mirror, my stomach dropped. The woman was running alongside the truck. Her movements were unnatural, her legs barely touching the ground as she kept pace with the speeding vehicle. Her pale face twisted in rage, her dark eyes boring into mine through the glass. I tore my gaze away, focusing on the road ahead. The woman's screams filled the cab, a piercing, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. You can't leave me, she shrieked, her voice reverberating like an echo in a canyon. The cab trembled as if something massive had slammed into the side of the truck. I fought to keep Betty steady, my hands shaking on the wheel. Go away. I shouted, my voice cracking. The truck swerved, the tires skidding against the asphalt. The specter's screams rose to a deafening pitch, and for a brief moment, I thought the windows might shatter. I pressed the gas harder, the truck lurching forward. The woman's face appeared at the edge of the windshield, her features twisted in a grotesque snarl. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The cab fell silent, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of the tires against the road. I slowed the truck to a crawl, my hands trembling as I wiped the sweat from my brow. The hitchhiker was gone, but her presence lingered, a cold weight pressing down on me. I reached for the paper on the dashboard, my eyes scanning the list of rules. Rule 3 stared back at me, never pick up a hitchhiker, no matter what they look like. Now I know why, I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. I pulled over a few miles later, needing a moment to collect myself. The air outside was cool, the faint rustle of the wind the only sound. I leaned against the hood of the truck, staring out at the dark expanse of the desert. My thoughts drifted to Karen again, her voice a soft echo in the back of my mind. I'm sorry, I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to, Karen, the hitchhiker, or myself. When I climbed back into the cab, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Whatever was out there, whatever rules governed this cursed highway, I wasn't going to let it break me. I gripped the wheel, my jaw set as I pressed the gas. The highway stretched on endlessly, the stars above cold and distant. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The desert around me seemed darker now, like the shadows were thicker, heavier, pressing against the edges of the headlights. Black Betty rumbled on, her engine running smoother now, but the unease in my chest didn't fade. The hitchhiker was gone, but her screams still echoed in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the rage, the desperation. The way she had run alongside the truck, her feet barely touching the ground. I glanced at the crumpled list of rules on the dashboard, my fingers brushing over the paper. Rule 4. If your radio starts playing static, don't touch it. Turn off the engine and wait. I prayed I wouldn't need to follow that one. It started as a faint crackle. At first, I thought it was just the engine, or maybe the wind outside. But as the seconds passed, the sound grew louder, more distinct. I glanced at the CB radio mounted on the dashboard. The display was dark, no frequency tuned, no signal coming through. But the static was unmistakable, filling the cab with its grating hiss. My pulse quickened, my hands tightening on the wheel. No, 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 I muttered under my breath. The static grew louder, crackling and popping like an old vinyl record. And then, through the static, came a voice. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as the seconds passed, it grew clearer, the words distorted but unmistakable. Jack. I froze. The voice was soft, almost familiar, like a memory dredged up from the deepest recesses of my mind. Jack, it said again, the tone gentle, pleading. I shook my head, gripping the wheel tighter. Nope. Not listening. Not tonight. The voice grew louder, the static crackling around it. Why did you leave me, Jack? My blood ran cold. It was Karen. I knew it wasn't possible. Karen had been gone for over a decade, buried in a quiet cemetery back in Illinois. But the voice coming through the static was hers. Why did you leave me? She asked again, her voice trembling with pain. I didn't, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I didn't leave you. The radio hissed, the static cutting in and out. You weren't there, Jack. You let me die. My chest tightened, my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't know, I started, but the words felt hollow, even to me. The air in the cab grew colder, the static rising to a deafening pitch. Outside, the darkness seemed to thicken, the shadows pressing against the windows like a living thing. The voice on the radio shifted, growing harsher, angrier. You promised to protect me, Jack, it said, Karen's soft tone replaced by something colder, darker. But you weren't there. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. I'm so sorry. The shadows outside the cab began to move, twisting and writhing like smoke caught in a strong wind. I reached for the radio instinctively, my fingers brushing against the dial. The static roared, the voice screaming now. Don't touch it, Jack. The list of rules flashed through my mind. Rule 4. If your radio starts playing static, don't touch it. Turn off the engine and wait. I pulled my hand back like I'd been burned, my breath coming in shallow gasps. With trembling fingers, I turned the key in the ignition. Black Betty shuddered as the engine cut out, plunging the cab into silence. The static stopped, replaced by an oppressive stillness. The shadows outside the cab stopped moving, but they didn't retreat. They lingered, pressing against the glass, their forms indistinct but menacing. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes locked on the dashboard. The minutes crawled by, each one stretching into an eternity. Come on, I whispered, my voice trembling. Come on. Just when I thought the silence would suffocate me, the radio crackled to life one last time. Jack. Karen's voice was soft again, almost tender. I forgive you. And then the static faded, leaving me alone in the cab. I waited another minute, then turned the key. Black Betty roared to life, her engine purring like a contented cat. The shadows outside the cab dissolved, fading back into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I put the truck into gear. The road ahead was empty, the desert stretching out endlessly under the cold glow of the stars. But the voice on the radio haunted me. It wasn't just Karen's words, it was the way she'd said them, the pain and anger in her tone. I hadn't been there for her when she needed me most, and now, on this cursed stretch of highway, I was paying the price. I glanced at the list of rules again, the crumpled paper resting on the dashboard. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were lifelines. I didn't know what else Highway 666 had in store for me, but one thing was certain, I wasn't going to survive unless I followed every single one of them. The desert stretched endlessly around me, a vast sea of shadows and jagged rocks. The sun was still hours away from rising, and the only light came from Black Betty's headlights, cutting two thin beams into the darkness. I gripped the wheel tighter, the events of the night weighing heavy on my chest. The red car. The hitchhiker. The radio. Each encounter had chipped away at my nerves, leaving me raw and exhausted. But I couldn't stop. Stopping felt like inviting whatever was out there to come closer. I was so focused on the road ahead that, at first, I didn't notice the figure in the distance. It was a faint shape at the edge of my headlights, almost blending in with the darkness. As I got closer, it resolved into something unmistakable, a deer. It stood in the middle of the highway, motionless, its head turned toward me. My heart sank. Rule 5. If you see a deer standing in the middle of the road, don't stop. Drive through it. The words echoed in my mind, and I felt my grip on the wheel tighten. Everything about the deer felt wrong. Its body was too still, its legs locked in place like a statue. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light from my headlights in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. I eased off the gas, my instinct screaming at me to slow down. This is insane, I muttered to myself, my voice shaking. The idea of driving through the deer felt wrong. I'd hit my share of animals during my years on the road, raccoons, coyotes, even a stray cow once, but something about this was different. The deer's glowing eyes seemed to follow me, watching as I approached. What if it's just a normal deer? I thought. What if I'm about to kill a real, living thing? I pressed the brakes, Black Betty groaning as she began to slow. The deer didn't move. It just stood there, its glowing eyes locked on mine. As the truck came to a crawl, I felt the air inside the cab grow colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I reached for the crumpled list on the dashboard, my eyes scanning Rule 5 again, don't stop. Drive through it. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. The moment the truck stopped, the shadows came. They slithered out of the desert like ink spreading across water, pooling around the truck in a thick, suffocating wave. The deer didn't move, but its eyes seemed to glow brighter, reflecting the shifting darkness around it. Panic clawed at my chest. I slammed my foot on the gas, Black Betty roaring back to life. The truck surged forward, the headlights illuminating the deer for one horrifying moment. Its body remained motionless, its legs locked in place. And then I hit it. The impact wasn't what I expected. There was no jolt, no sound of shattering bone or crunching metal. Instead, the cab filled with a deafening, otherworldly scream. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't an animal's cry or the screech of tires on pavement. It was deep and guttural, layered with whispers and echoes, as if the entire desert were screaming in unison. The noise seemed to press against me, wrapping around my body like a vice. My vision blurred, and my ears rang as I fought to keep the truck steady. "Come on, Betty," I muttered through clenched teeth. "Come on." When the scream finally stopped, the silence was overwhelming. I eased off the gas, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, but the road ahead was empty. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the deer's broken body lying on the asphalt. There was nothing. No blood. No fur. Just a faint smear of black ichor, glistening in the moonlight. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. The truck's engine hummed steadily, a comforting sound after the chaos. But my mind raced, replaying the events over and over. That wasn't a deer. Whatever I'd hit, it wasn't natural. I reached for the list of rules again, my fingers trembling. Rule 5 had saved me, but the weight of what I'd done, what I'd encountered, pressed down on me like a physical force. As I sat there, trying to steady my breathing, I noticed something in the distance. A faint shape stood on the horizon, just barely visible in the glow of the moonlight. It was the deer. It stood motionless, its glowing eyes locked on me, as if watching, waiting. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay here. I put Black Betty into gear, the truck rumbling back onto the highway. The road stretched out before me, endless and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were survival. And the more I followed them, the more I realized just how thin the line between life and death really was. I didn't think it could get any worse. The red car, the hitchhiker, the voice on the radio, the deer, I'd endured them all. My nerves were shredded, my body shaking with exhaustion, but Black Betty still rumbled down Highway 666, steady and relentless. Dawn was close. I could feel it. The sky ahead had softened from pitch black to a deep, inky blue. If I could just make it to sunrise, I'd be okay. At least, that's what I told myself. The highway stretched out endlessly in front of me, the desert shadows retreating ever so slightly as the first hint of light touched the horizon. But the relief I'd been expecting never came. Something still wasn't right. The air inside the cab felt heavy, pressing against my chest like a weight. My skin prickled with unease, the back of my neck tingling as if I were being watched. I glanced at the list of rules on the dashboard, the words practically burned into my brain by now. And then I heard it. The first knock was soft, almost tentative. It came from the passenger side door, a faint tap 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 that sent a shiver down my spine. I gripped the wheel tighter, my heart pounding. The knocking came again, louder this time. Knock. 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 Rule 6. If you hear knocking on the passenger side door, don't look or respond. Just keep driving. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to stay on the road. Jack. The voice was muffled, but I recognized it instantly. Karen. Jack, please, let me in. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be her. It wasn't her. I clenched my jaw, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. It's not real, I muttered under my breath. It's not real. The voice grew louder, more desperate. Jack, it's me. Please. I'm so cold. Tears stung my eyes as I fought the urge to glance at the passenger side window. I wanted to look. I wanted to see her face, to believe for just one moment that she was really there. But I knew better. The knocking grew more insistent, the sound reverberating through the cab. Knock. 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 Don't leave me out here, Jack, Karen said, her voice trembling with emotion. Please. I need you. The air inside the cab grew colder, frost forming on the edges of the windshield. Outside, the shadows pressed closer, swirling around the truck like a living thing. The knocking stopped, replaced by a soft, scraping sound, fingernails dragging across the metal door. I clenched my teeth, my body trembling as the voice returned, sharper now, angrier. You promised to protect me, Karen said, her tone venomous. But you weren't there. You left me. My vision blurred with tears, guilt clawing at my chest like a physical pain. I'm sorry, I whispered, the words barely audible. The scraping stopped, replaced by silence. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. And then the passenger side door creaked. My stomach dropped as the door handle began to turn, the sound deafening in the stillness. Don't look, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. Don't look. Don't look. The door didn't open, but the voice came again, closer now. I'm here, Jack, Karen said. I'm right here. Just look at me. My mind flashed back to the night she died, the phone call I'd ignored, the sound of her voice on the answering machine. She'd needed me, and I hadn't been there. And now, on this cursed highway, she was back, or at least something pretending to be her. I tightened my grip on the wheel, my jaw clenched. You're not real, I said through gritted teeth. You're not her. The voice grew quieter, softer. Are you sure? The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. The air inside the cab grew warmer, the frost on the windshield melting away. The knocking stopped, and the weight on my chest lifted, leaving me gasping for breath. I glanced at the passenger side door. The handle was back in its place, the metal unblemished. Whatever had been out there was gone. I pulled off to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I killed the engine. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring out at the desert. The sun rose higher, painting the landscape in shades of gold and orange. I'd survived the night. But the list of rules on the dashboard was a stark reminder that Highway 666 wasn't finished with me yet. As I started Black Betty back up and pulled onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that the highway had taken something from me. Maybe it was my sanity. Maybe it was my peace of mind. Or maybe it was just a piece of my soul. But one thing was certain, Highway 666 wasn't just a road. It was a test. And somehow, I'd passed, this time.